Book 1, Chapter 33 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 33. The golden eagle is cut to pieces. Herod's barbarity when he was ready to die. He attempts to kill himself. He commands Antipater to be slain. He survives him 5 days and then dies. Now Herod's distemper became more and more severe to him, and this because these disorders fell upon him in his old age, and when he was in a melancholy condition, for he was already 70 years of age, and had been brought by the calamities that had happened to him about his children, whereby he had no pleasure in life, even when he was in health. The grief also that Antipater was still alive aggravated his disease, whom he resolved to put to death now not at random, but as soon as he should be well again, and resolved to have him slain in a public manner. There also now happened to him, among his other calamities, a certain popular sedition. There were 2 men of learning in the city, Jerusalem, who were thought the most skillful in the laws of their country, and were on that account held in very great esteem all over the nation. They were, the one Judas, the son of Sepphoris, the other Matthias, the son of Margallus. There was a great concourse of the young men to these men when they expounded the laws, and there got together every day a kind of army of such as were growing up to be men. Now when these men were informed that the king was wearing away with melancholy, and with a distemper, they dropped words to their acquaintance, how it was now a very proper time to defend the cause of God, and to pull down what had been erected contrary to the laws of their country, for it was unlawful there should be any such thing in the temple as images or faces, or the like representation of any animal whatsoever. Now the king had put up a golden eagle over the great gate of the temple, which these learned men exhorted them to cut down, and told them that if there should any danger arise, it was a glorious thing to die for the laws of their country, because that the soul was immortal, and that an eternal enjoyment of happiness did await such as died on that account, while the mean-spirited, and those that were not wise enough to show a right love of their souls, preferred a death by a disease, before that which is the result of a virtuous behavior. At the same time that these men made this speech to their disciples, a rumor was spread about that the king was dying, which made the young men set about the work with greater boldness. They therefore let themselves down from the top of the temple with thick cords, and this at midday, and while a great number of people were in the temple, and cut down that golden eagle with axes. At this the king was in such an extravagant passion that he overcame his disease, for the time, and went out, and spake to the people, wherein he made a terrible accusation against those men, as being guilty of sacrilege, and as making greater attempts under pretence of their law, and he thought they deserved to be punished as impious persons. Whereupon the people were afraid lest a great number should be found guilty, and desired that when he had first punished those that put him upon this work, and then those that were caught in it, he would leave off his anger as to the rest. With this the king complied, though not without difficulty, and ordered those that had let themselves down, together with their Rabbins, to be burnt alive, and delivered the rest that were caught to the proper officers, to be put to death by them. After this the distemper seized upon his whole body, and greatly disordered all its parts with various symptoms, for there was a gentle fever upon him, and an intolerable itching all over the surface of his body, and continual pains in his colon, and dropsical turnouts about his feet, and an inflammation of the abdomen, and a putrefaction of his privy member, that produced worms. Besides which he had a difficulty of breathing upon him, and could not breathe but when he sat upright, and had a convulsion of all his members, insomuch that the diviners said these diseases were a punishment upon him for what he had done to the Rabbins. Yet did he struggle with his numerous disorders, and still had a desire to live, and hoped for recovery, and considered of several methods of cure. Accordingly he went over Jordan, and made use of those hot baths at Callirrhoe, which ran into the lake Asphaltites, but are themselves sweet enough to be drunk. And here the physicians thought proper to bathe his whole body in warm oil, by letting it down into a large vessel full of oil, whereupon his eyes failed him, and he came and went as if he was dying, and as a tumult was then made by his servants, at their voice he revived again. Yet did he after this despair of recovery, and gave orders that each soldier should have 50 drachmae apiece, and that his commanders and friends should have great sums of money given them. He then returned back and came to Jericho, in such a melancholy state of body as almost threatened him with present death, when he proceeded to attempt a horrid wickedness, for he had got together the most illustrious men of the whole Jewish nation, out of every village, into a place called the Hippodrome, and there shut them in. He then called for his sister Salome, and her husband Alexis, and made this speech to them: "I know well enough that the Jews will keep a festival upon my death. However, it is in my power to be mourned for on other accounts, and to have a splendid funeral, if you will but be subservient to my commands. Do you but take care to send soldiers to encompass these men that are now in custody, and slay them immediately upon my death, and then all Judea, and every family of them, will weep at it, whether they will or no." These were the commands he gave them, when there came letters from his ambassadors at Rome, whereby information was given that Acme was put to death at Caesar's command, and that Antipater was condemned to die. However, they wrote withal, that if Herod had a mind rather to banish him, Caesar permitted him to do so. So he for a little while revived, and had a desire to live, but presently he was overborne by his pains, and was disordered by want of food, and by a convulsive cough, and endeavoured to prevent a natural death. So he took an apple, and asked for a knife, for he used to pare apples and eat them. He then looked round about to see that there was nobody to hinder him, and lift up his right hand as if he would stab himself. But Archelaus, his first cousin, came running to him, and held his hand, and hindered him from so doing, on which occasion a very great lamentation was made in the palace, as if the king were expiring. As soon as ever Antipater heard that, he took courage, and with joy in his looks, besought his keepers for a sum of money to loose him and let him go. But the principal keeper of the prison did not only obstruct him in that his intention, but ran and told the king what his design was. Hereupon the king cried out louder than his distemper would well bear, and immediately sent some of his guards and slew Antipater. He also gave orders to have him buried at Hyrcanium, and altered his testament again, and therein made Archelaus his eldest son, and the brother of Antipas, his successor, and made Antipas tetrarch. So Herod, having survived the slaughter of his son 5 days, died, having reigned 34 years since he had caused Antigonus to be slain, and obtained his kingdom, but 37 years since he had been made king by the Romans. Now as for his fortune, it was prosperous in all other respects, if ever any other man could be so, since from a private man he obtained the kingdom, and kept it so long, and left it to his own sons. But still in his domestic affairs he was a most unfortunate man. Now before the soldiers knew of his death, Salome and her husband came out and dismissed those that were in bonds, whom the king had commanded to be slain, and told them that he had altered his mind, and would have every one of them sent to their own homes. When these men were gone, Salome told the soldiers the king was dead, and got them and the rest of the multitude together to an assembly in the amphitheatre at Jericho, where Ptolemy, who was entrusted by the king with his signet ring, came before them, and spake of the happiness the king had attained, and comforted the multitude, and read the epistle which had been left for the soldiers, wherein he earnestly exhorted them to bear good will to his successor. And after he had read the epistle, he opened and read his testament, wherein Philip was to inherit Trachonitis and the neighbouring countries, and Antipas was to be tetrarch, as we said before, and Archelaus was made king. He had also been commanded to carry Herod's ring to Caesar, and the settlements he had made sealed up, because Caesar was to be lord of all the settlements he had made, and was to confirm his testament, and he ordered that the dispositions he had made were to be kept as they were in his former testament. So there was an acclamation made to Archelaus, to congratulate him upon his advancement, and the soldiers, with the multitude, went round about in troops, and promised him their good will, and besides prayed to God to bless his government. After this they betook themselves to prepare for the king's funeral, and Archelaus omitted nothing of magnificence therein, but brought out all the royal ornaments to augment the pomp of the deceased. There was a bier all of gold, embroidered with precious stones, and a purple bed of various contexture, with the dead body upon it, covered with purple, and a diadem was put upon his head, and a crown of gold above it, and a sceptre in his right hand, and near to the bier were Herod's sons, and a multitude of his kindred, next to which came his guards, and the regiment of Thracians, the Germans also, and Gauls, all accounted as if they were going to war, but the rest of the army went foremost, armed, and following their captains and officers in a regular manner, after whom 500 of his domestic servants and freedmen followed, with sweet spices in their hands, and the body was carried 200 furlongs to Herodium, where he had given order to be buried. And this shall suffice for the conclusion of the life of Herod. End of Book 1, Chapter 33. End of Book 1. Book 2, Chapters 1 and 2 of the Wars of the Jews. Chapter 1. Archelaus makes a funeral feast for the people, on the account of Herod, after which a great tumult is raised by the multitude, and he sends the soldiers out upon them, who destroy about 3,000 of them. Now the necessity which Archelaus was under of taking a journey to Rome was the occasion of new disturbances, for when he had mourned for his father 7 days, Here Dean Aldrich's note on this place, the law or custom of the Jews, says he, requires 7 days mourning for the dead, whence the author of the book of Ecclesiasticus, chapter 22, verse 12, assigns 7 days as the proper time of mourning for the dead, and chapter 38, verse 17, enjoins men to mourn for the dead, that they may not be evil spoken of. For, as Josephus says presently, if anyone omits this mourning, funeral feast, he is not esteemed a holy person. How it is certain that such a 7 days' mourning has been customary from times of the greatest antiquity, Genesis 1:10. Funeral feasts are also mentioned as of considerable antiquity, Ezekiel 24:17, Jeremiah 16:7, Pray 31:6, Deuteronomy 26:14, Josephus of the War. And had given a very expensive funeral feast to the multitude, which custom is the occasion of poverty to many of the Jews, because they are forced to feast the multitude, for if any one omits it he is not esteemed a holy person. He put on a white garment, and went up to the temple, where the people accosted him with various acclamations. He also spake kindly to the multitude from an elevated seat and a throne of gold, and returned them thanks for the zeal they had shown about his father's funeral, and the submission they had made to him, as if he were already settled in the kingdom. But he told them withal, that he would not at present take upon him either the authority of a king, or the names thereto belonging, until Caesar, who is made lord of this whole affair by the testament, confirms the succession. For that when the soldiers would have set the diadem on his head at Jericho, he would not accept of it, but that he would make abundant requittals, not to the soldiers only, but to the people, for their alacrity and goodwill to him, when the superior lords, the Romans, should have given him a complete title to the kingdom, for that it should be his study to appear in all things better than his father. Upon this the multitude were pleased, and presently made a trial of what he intended, by asking great things of him. For some made a clamour that he would ease them in their taxes, others that he would take off the duties upon commodities, and some that he would loose those that were in prison. In all which cases he answered readily to their satisfaction, in order to get the goodwill of the multitude, after which he offered the proper sacrifices, and feasted with his friends. And here it was that a great many of those that desired innovations came in crowds toward the evening, and began to mourn on their own account, when the public mourning for the king was over. These lamented those that were put to death by Herod, because they had cut down the golden eagle that had been over the gate of the temple. Nor was this mourning of a private nature, but the lamentations were very great, the mourning solemn, the weeping such as was loudly heard over the city, as being for those men who had perished for the laws of their country, and for the temple. They cried out that a punishment ought to be inflicted for those men upon those that were honored by Herod, and that, in the first place, the man whom he had made high priest should be deprived, and that it was fit to choose a person of greater piety and purity than he was. At these clamours Archelaus was provoked, but restrained himself from taking vengeance on the authors, on account of the haste he was in going to Rome, as fearing lest, upon his making war on the multitude, such an action might detain him at home. Accordingly, he made trial to quiet the innovators by persuasion rather than by force, and sent his general in a private way to them, and by him exhorted them to be quiet. But the seditious threw stones at him, and drove him away, as he came into the temple, and before he could say anything to them. The like treatment they showed to others, who came to them after him, many of which were sent by Archelaus, in order to reduce them to sobriety, and these answered still on all occasions after a passionate manner, and it openly appeared that they would not be quiet, if their numbers were but considerable. And indeed, at the feast of unleavened bread, which was now at hand, and is by the Jews called the Passover, and used to he celebrated with a great number of sacrifices, an innumerable multitude of the people came out of the country to worship. Some of these stood in the temple bewailing the Rabbins that had been put to death, and procured their sustenance by begging, in order to support their sedition. At this Archelaus was affrighted, and privately sent a tribune, with his cohort of soldiers, upon them, before the disease should spread over the whole multitude, and gave orders that they should constrain those that began the tumult by force to be quiet. At these the whole multitude were irritated, and threw stones at many of the soldiers, and killed them, but the tribune fled away wounded, and had much ado to escape so. After which they betook themselves to their sacrifices, as if they had done no mischief, nor did it appear to Archelaus that the multitude could be restrained without bloodshed, so he sent his whole army upon them, the footmen in great multitudes by way of the city, and the horsemen by way of the plain, who falling upon them on the sudden, as they were offering their sacrifices, destroyed about 3,000 of them, but the rest of the multitude were dispersed upon the adjoining mountains. These were followed by Archelaus's heralds, who commanded every one to retire to their own homes, whither they all went and left the festival. Chapter 2. Archelaus goes to Rome with a great number of his kindred. He is there accused before Caesar by Antipater, but is superior to his accusers in judgment by the means of that defense which Nicolaus made for him. Archelaus went down now to the seaside, with his mother and his friends Publius and Ptolemy and Nicolaus, and left behind him Philip, to be his steward in the palace, and to take care of his domestic affairs. Salome went also along with him with her sons, as did also the king's brethren and sons-in-law. These in appearance went to give him all the assistance they were able, in order to secure his succession, but in reality to accuse him for his breach of the laws by what he had done at the temple. But as they were coming to Caesarea, Sabinus, the procurator of Syria, met them. He was going up to Judea, to secure Herod's effects, but Varus, president of Syria, who was come thither, restrained him from going any farther. This Varus Archelaus had sent for, by the earnest entreaty of Ptolemy. At this time, indeed, Sabinus, to gratify Varus, neither went to the citadels, nor did he shut up the treasuries where his father's money was laid up, but promised that he would lie still, until Caesar should have taken cognizance of the affair. So he abode at Caesarea, but as soon as those that were his hindrance were gone, when Varus was gone to Antioch, and Archelaus was sailed to Rome, he immediately went on to Jerusalem, and seized upon the palace. And when he had called for the governors of the citadels, and the stewards of the king's private affairs, he tried to sift out the accounts of the money, and to take possession of the citadels. But the governors of those citadels were not unmindful of the commands laid upon them by Archelaus, and continued to guard them, and said the custody of them rather belonged to Caesar than to Archelaus. In the meantime Antipas went also to Rome, to strive for the kingdom, and to insist that the former testament, wherein he was named to be king, was valid before the latter testament. Salome had also promised to assist him, as had many of Archelaus's kindred, who sailed along with Archelaus himself also. He also carried along with him his mother, and Ptolemy, the brother of Nicolaus, who seemed one of great weight, on account of the great trust Herod put in him, he having been one of his most honored friends. However, Antipas depended chiefly upon Irenaeus, the orator, upon whose authority he had rejected such as advised him to yield to Archelaus, because he was his elder brother, and because the second testament gave the kingdom to him. The inclinations also of all Archelaus's kindred, who hated him, were removed to Antipas, when they came to Rome, although in the first place every one rather desired to live under their own laws, without a king, and to be under a Roman governor. But if they should fail in that point, these desired that Antipas might be their king. Sabinus did also afford these his assistance to the same purpose by letters he sent, wherein he accused Archelaus before Caesar, and highly commended Antipas. Salome also, and those with her, put the crimes which they accused Archelaus of in order, and put them into Caesar's hands. And after they had done that, Archelaus wrote down the reasons of his claim, and by Ptolemy send in his father's ring and his father's accounts. And when Caesar had maturely weighed by himself what both had to allege for themselves, as also had considered of the great burden of the kingdom and largeness of the revenues, and withal the number of the children Herod had left behind him, and had moreover read the letters he had received from Varus and Sabinus on this occasion, he assembled the principal persons among the Romans together, in which assembly Caius, the son of Agrippa, and his daughter Julius, but by himself adopted for his own son, sat in the first seat, and gave the pleaders leave to speak. Then stood up Salome's son, Antipater, who of all Archelaus's antagonists was the shrewdest pleader, and accused him in the following speech: that Archelaus did in words contend for the kingdom, but that in deeds he had long exercised royal authority, and so did but insult Caesar in desiring now to be heard on that account, since he had not stayed for his determination about the succession, and since he had suborned certain persons, after Herod's death, to move for putting the diadem upon his head, since he had set himself down in the throne, and given answers as a king, and altered the disposition of the army, and granted to some higher dignities, that he had also complied in all things with the people in the request they had made to him as to their king, and had also dismissed those that had been put into bonds by his father for most important reasons. Now, after all this, he desires the shadow of that royal authority, whose substance he had already seized to himself, and so hath made Caesar lord, not of things, but of words. He also reproached him further, that his mourning for his father was only pretended, while he put on a sad countenance in the daytime, but drank to great excess in the night, from which behaviour, he said, the late disturbance among the multitude came, while they had an indignation thereat. And indeed the purport of his whole discourse was to aggravate Archelaus's crime in slaying such a multitude about the temple, which multitude came to the festival, but were barbarously slain in the midst of their own sacrifices. And he said there was such a vast number of dead bodies heaped together in the temple, as even a foreign war, that should come upon them suddenly, before it was denounced, could not have heaped together. And he added that it was the foresight his father had of that his barbarity, which made him never give him any hopes of the kingdom, but when his mind was more infirm than his body, and he was not able to reason soundly, and did not well know what was the character of that son, whom in his second testament he had made his successor, and this was done by him at a time when he had no complaints to make of him whom he had named before, when he was sound in body, and when his mind was free from all passion. That, however, if any one should suppose Herod's judgment, when he was sick, was superior to that at another time, yet had Archelaus forfeited his kingdom by his own behaviour, and those actions, which were contrary to the law, and to its disadvantage. Or what sort of a king will this man be, when he hath obtained the government from Caesar, who hath slain so many before he hath obtained it? When Antipater had spoken largely to this purpose, and had produced a great number of Archelaus's kindred as witnesses, to prove every part of the accusation, he ended his discourse. Then stood up Nicholas to plead for Archelaus. He alleged that the slaughter in the temple could not be avoided, that those that were slain were become enemies not to Archelaus's kingdom only, but to Caesar, who was to determine about him. He also demonstrated that Archelaus's accusers had advised him to perpetrate other things, of which he might have been accused. But he insisted that the latter testament should, for this reason, above all others, be esteemed valid, because Herod had therein appointed Caesar to be the person who should confirm the succession. For he who showed such prudence as to recede from his own power, and yielded up to the Lord of the world, cannot be supposed mistaken in his judgment about him that was to be his heir, and he that so well knew whom to choose for an arbitrator of the succession could not be unacquainted with him whom he chose for his successor. When Nicholas had gone through all he had to say, Archelaus came and fell down before Caesar's knees, without any noise, upon which he raised him up, after a very obliging manner, and declared that truly he was worthy to succeed his father. However, he still made no firm determination in his case, but when he had dismissed those assessors that had been with him that day, he deliberated by himself about the allegations which he had heard, whether it were fit to constitute any of those named in the testaments for Herod's successor, or whether the government should be parted among all his posterity, and this because of the number of those that seemed to stand in need of support therefrom. End of Book 2, Chapters 1 and 2.